All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Unslaved Podcast, episode 105. My name is David Whitehead, and I am extremely excited for this show today. We have Eric Fott coming on the show, and he's calling in all the way from Japan. And Japan is one of those places that I've always wanted to visit, and it's got a rich martial art history. And Eric has a fantastic website called warrior-forge, FORGE.com. He talks about mental martial arts. He talks about, he's got an interesting blog. He's got articles talking about Jiu Jitsu. Hey, we're going to go along great, Eric. He's got lots of good information, and he speaks a lot about the same type of things that I've been trying to discuss, which is the esoteric side of martial arts, which is essentially talking about how to strengthen your psychological immunity and what kind of gnosis is involved in the martial art traditions of the world that are all about doing that. So let me just get, I don't know why Eric is muted here. Hold on. There we go. Eric, can you hear us, my friend? Oh, hold on a sec. He's still muted. Forgive me here 1 second. I don't know why we can't. Bear with us, folks. There we go. There we go, Eric. Now we can hear you. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thanks for joining us all the way. I know it's late for you, but welcome.
Going on 1:30. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an honor. And Michael, thanks for hooking this up as well. Michael,
Oh
maybe
yeah.
over to you real quick. How did you come across Eric's site and his work?
Well, Eric contacted us as a member of the Mystery School, so I've known him for many years,
Mm,
and yeah, he has had quite an exciting life. You know, being in the military and also deeply into jujitsu, which of course is very esoteric in one sense and one of the hardest of the martial arts. So it's always good for me to encounter people like Eric and yourself, David, who are into martial arts but are looking at the esoteric side. But then one of the traps there is that maybe it still isn't verbalized in Western sort of context. It still may be sort of orientally oriented, which personally I don't like, because there's so much that there's so much in the Eastern mystical tradition which has become corrupted, and my focus has always been the Western magical tradition. So if you read Eric's book, we not only have a sort of a, like you say, a grounding and a practicalization, you know, because I mean today any esoteric subject will only matter if it can be sort of grounded in some sort of self-help practical aspects, you know, and Eric's onto that. But also that it's in Western language. It's just, you know, that was an attracting thing to me. It's in it's taking the principles of martial arts, which mostly I have no clue about. I mean, that part of his work, any work on that is, you know, something I'm still learning about. uh, but when somebody then voices it in sort of a psychological language, that's an important bridge, you know, that brings all of these different traditions together, because so many people can write on that, but completely leave out consciousness, or leave out, you know, like you're saying, psychic self-defense and all of these principles. So what Eric's good at doing is showing that martial arts isn't just something of the East and something over there separate, or maybe just understood as physical culture or sport. Who knows how the way people are looking at it today. But as a matter of fact, it's another voice, you know, in the parliament of spiritual, you know, and that includes the West. So yeah, it was more fascinating even from that point of view, because it's written by a Western man who's into Nordic culture and Western culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, but can see in the Eastern teachings that which is synergistic to the Western paradigm. That is so rare today. So a big thank you to Eric for mustering that. You know, how long did you actually? You must have been researching this for an age. How long really have you been working on?
To be frank, it's kind of like you. It wasn't until maybe about a year and a half ago where that term mental martial arts kind of came around, and I realized what it was I was looking at or digging into. You know, almost as if you're digging for a long time through a tunnel, and you're not sure where it's going to lead, but you just feel compelled to keep digging. And so a lot of notes that were compiled about a lot of just either remnants from martial arts training, whatever I might think about, jiu-jitsu itself, or also about the nature of interactions with other people on a verbal level or on other subjective informational impressions and stuff like this, and just kind of it was a whole lot of nothing, it seemed like in the beginning, and then later on, thanks to certain keynote experiences along the way, it all kind of came together after that. And so that was, you could say this book was about a solid year to a year and a half, and working on this book particularly.
And how long have you been studying jiu-jitsu for, Eric? I can't help but ask.
Ooh, from 2003.
Nice.
Yeah, from 2003, and I got my black belt. What's 2018 now? So I think 2 years ago, 2016. And yeah, the
It's
speaking of the mystery
Japanese
school,
jiu-jitsu, right? It's Japanese jiu-jitsu or Brazilian jiu-jitsu?
Brazilian.
Okay, great.
Speaking of the mystery school, you'd be surprised just how much correlates between the. See, the great thing about the Path of the Fool book is that when you list your definitions for different arcanum and arcana, you'll do it in a way where it's like a lot of possible terminology associated with a given image and a given setting. So then from there, you might say, ooh, well, the Emperor is a future focus it's like a future orientated card with goals, and there's also the element of discipline, and people of this kind of magnitude tend to have a certain kingly demeanor or an authoritative demeanor about them. And so you'll put the various meanings about a given card there. And just going through that book several times over, working with the tarot in my own way, over the years, that ends up taking on a different language of its own, because after so long, I'm sure you get a test, you don't really pick up the book so much anymore for the same reasons, and the certain definitions kind of take on their own connotation to you. So there's a very strong relationship between mental martial arts and the literate, the ability to interpret the imagery of the tarot, and how, say, one arcana might relate to another, so on and so
Yeah.
forth. Like the Fool and the Devil, for instance.
Yeah, I hear you.
And
Oh, yeah.
I'll get into that later.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I hear that really clearly. Yeah. But what got you interested in in Eastern practices like that in the first place? What was the original attraction?
Oh, well, I just kind of wound up here in the East, you know, based on work. So before, when I was in the Navy, I was stationed here in Japan, and I was only ever in Japan pertaining to that. So later on, I got out of the Navy and I came back to California, and went to school for massage therapy, and then I was working as a massage therapist for a few years. And then the opportunity came around to come back over here, and unless you were working in a certain venue as a masseuse in California, say, for example, in a hospital, or for a chiropractor, where clientele can be regular, and insurance usually picks up the tab for the clients in that respect. Whereas all my experience was with spa and salons, so it was more of a pampering, or kind of a luxury item to go and get massage work done for the kind of clients I would deal with. So needless to say, things were not as lucrative as I would have liked them to be. And so when the opportunity came to come back to Japan, I certainly picked up that one, and found myself back here. So, and then coming back here, as David asked, yeah, it's certainly not Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I remember hearing a long time ago, the second largest Brazilian population is in Japan, outside of Brazil, and then vice versa.
Never knew.
So I'm not too sure as to what amounts to that statistic, But yeah, so there's quite a few Brazilians over here, and quite a few of them are in. They have quite the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community in Japan.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I
excellent.
never see, these are the things I was saying is very esoteric to me, that, you know, I have a general appreciation of it, but the details are, you know, way beyond me. I'm still learning to that degree.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mean, my background in jiu-jitsu is I have the majority of my degrees come from Japanese jiu-jitsu, but it was a more I learned it in Canada, of course, but it was under some instructors that had a very well-rounded approach to it, so it was a bit more modernized and updated. And then I started training specifically Brazilian jiu-jitsu just to add to that aspect of the game. But I love that whole dynamic and the philosophy of jiu-jitsu, which is the idea of going with, you're not trying to fight force with force. You're trying to redirect. You're trying to work on technique, leverage. So it's a very specialized type of martial art that is, I feel, a very holistic approach to combat training, self-defense, but also when you can take those concepts that you're working with the body and that you're using on the mats with your partners and whatnot, when you can take those concepts and you can apply them in other areas of your life, it's life changing. And that's been everything I've been trying to talk about, is coming at it from a sort of Bruce Lee concept where you have these different movements and you have specific techniques, but if you take only that from the training, you're missing out. That's just the surface layer. And eventually your whole point is to try to integrate that back into you and to enhance you. And that's where that esoteric side comes in. That's where that you can blend that philosophy from East and West. That's one thing I love about Bruce Lee, was that he was able to do that. He was able to study the philosophy of Western culture and then take what he had learned from Eastern culture and give a sort of blend of it. And I feel like as a martial artist, that's what I've done. I've studied many martial arts styles, but I thoroughly love jiu-jitsu. It's sort of my home base martial art. And you know, I've seen that when you approach martial arts in that same way, where you're getting, you know, you're trying to learn many different techniques and styles, and even within, say, jiu-jitsu, there are styles of jiu-jitsu. Every instructor you go with, you're going to have a different approach to it, but the fundamentals remain the same. And then when you take all that information back, you end up sort of creating your own style, which is where you can get that unique expression element involved in it.
Well, like you said, with integrating more than just the movements that you do on the mat, or that you perform with sparring partners or something like that, there's a kind of willingness that you need to have to want to make it more than just a sport,
Mm.
or just some type of fitness activity, you know, to blow off steam or something like that. There has to be a kind of curiosity and a compulsion present that, you know, and it's really abstract and vague in the beginning, because you're really not all that sure. You know, when you say get out of high school and you're just kind of bebopping down the street and, you know, going through life, but there's something that compels you to keep doing that kind of thing, and additionally to ask questions that, you know, once you face certain experiences and so on and so forth, and you just kind of keep the ball rolling, and it's by way of that that you're allowed to just kind of continue on, and, you know, the puzzle expands from the tabletop to some surface much vaster than what you would have conceived of it, you know, so many checkpoints before that. So
Mm.
yeah.
Your book also brings out that within these disciplines there are certain limits. This is something that, you know, you've spotted. It's not that they're deliberate or anything like that, but they're within any system or hierarchy, there's going to be limits. So what you're trying to do is address those, right? Bruce Lee was also of that school, right? Bringing in sort of personal approaches and emphasizing how attitude is important as a part of the regimen, you know. And you'll take us through some slides, because the subtitle of your book is Answering the Riddle of Steel, or Solving the Riddle of Steel. And steel for you turns out to be reason. So here's one of those branches I was talking about earlier on between psychology and philosophy that you've done, which I, you know, think is quite original, actually. So maybe you can define those terms later when we get to the slides, but just an overview, what are those limits, and how would you improve upon that? You know, because what I got from your whole thing was that this is about psychic immunity. It is about raising one's level of discernment in life in general. And then, of course, it's excellent to get into the martial arts because that's going to actually assist the martial arts properly held. The high version of it is going to upgrade your selfhood. This is what the book, I think, is really all about, which is why it's so needed. But again, subcategories of that is a strengthening of psychic immunity, a raising of discernment. You mentioned all of this, and you mentioned the sort of Reichian, elements as well, which would be that real development is apophatic or deconstructive. It's not just about gaining more, and then you even have some Stoic elements, which we might touch on. But before, without getting into the massive detail, what would you improve about the martial arts regimens now in regards personalism, selfhood, and some of these areas that might break the limits as you see them, that need to be maybe gone beyond or sort of exceeded? How would we exceed the limits in a positive way?
Okay, so I'll go into that question by acknowledging the one of the initial ones, which was limitation. You asked something specific to limitations. Can you refresh my memory if you recollect what you said specifically?
Obviously, within any structure, there's going to be limits. See, it's like, remember Michelangelo or Leonardo? I think it was Leonardo da Vinci who said that the job of the student is to surpass the master. How are you going to do that unless you have an eye or a discernment for the limits of the particular system? And it's not egoism or hubris that notices this. It's a simple discernment. So what I got from your book is that you've isolated several of these limitations and then suggested certain ways, by which they may be, because a limitation is a challenge. Remember, the hieroglyphic for crisis is also that for heroic challenge. And this is what I see your whole book is doing that. It's sort of saying, I see the limits of it, and I'm up to offering, one doesn't have to accept it or whatever, but I'm up to offering solutions of how we exceed those limits, taking those limits as a sign of improvement. Here, there's something that hasn't been quite worked out or straightened out, and then you've gone after that. Would you agree that that's what you're about?
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head, because strategy is a very important concept for mental martial arts. And, a lot of people look at limitation as, a big bummer. And it can be from the onset, or the realization that, man, gravity exists. I guess I can't fly. That sucks. And, that just kind of goes away when you realize, well, what you can't do helps reshape and redirect the ability to conceive what it is that you can do within limitations. There's a lot of downing of hierarchy, but it's also necessary as well. I couldn't imagine, like, for example, Dave, you step on the mat, and if there was no ability to discern who's of what skill by color, I mean, certainly in tournaments, then you'd face the prospect of sandbagging people that, draw a white belt, but they've had like 10 years experience. So, 10-year guy fighting some, 6-month guy, and they both wear a white belt. I mean, that's not really all that great,
right,
for the beginner. But, limitations, to identify limitations allows you to, as you said, Michael, to create some workaround, or to work within those limitations to eventually usurp them and surmount them. And so then the limitations themselves did nothing more than compel you to have to use your mind. Limitations make you think. And if you meet them like that, then they're really just, just another piece, there's one more star in the constellation. So limitations to identify and acknowledge and develop a different relationship with limitations is absolutely critical. Otherwise, I wouldn't know what you'd be if you weren't willing to face reality. See, it goes back to that term that's oftentimes replete through unslaved podcasts. People who are unwilling to face reality because of XYZ. if you're not willing to make some monetary sacrifices in order to, develop some kind of savings, then hypothetically, when you go and kick the bucket or go and retire later, or some emergency happens, you're not even going to be able to, replace your tire when you blow out a tire in your car, or check into the hospital when some haphazard thing happens to you at work. I mean, this is common sense stuff. But if it's not acknowledged like that, then big problems for people who just. Pardon?
Or you turn back to the misleaders, right? If there's no autonomy in the way that we've been describing it, you talk also about the mind guards, is your term for it, where when in doubt, turn to the fucking mind guards, who have created the system, have the one size fits all solutions for any and all problems, as if that is really the case. The moment that somebody moves into a deeper phase of life, psychologically or philosophy, those mind guards, turn out to be like just like toy soldiers. It doesn't work. But one other aspect that you bring up, maybe you could talk about that before we go to the slides, is that your premise is the ultimate mystical premise. How can you take the reins of your life through will or through heroism if you're in inner conflict? So do you see martial arts then as because David has talked about this before, do you see the same thing, that martial arts is a vehicle to then dealing with this ontological, you find it, you don't create it, you find that you're in a dualistic situation with the world and other people, you find that you're in a state of inner conflict, and then you find that there has to be a way to remedy it and solution. How do you see martial arts, for instance, in your experience, as sort of instrumental in overcoming that kind of inner conflict that people are in?
Well, there's, contrary to, say you just go to the gym and you lift weights and you amass size on your body, or you sculpt your body like this. I mean, those are results, and it helps keep people who are interested in that kind of thing to keep going back and enduring the kind of pain that comes with intense fitness regimens like that. The difference with martial arts always to me was that you are working in more comprehensive understanding alongside physical fitness regimentation. So you have to engage your critical ability. Well, in the beginning, you're not really all that critical because, Joe Black Belt's telling you, do this, do that, and you're simply trying to keep up, and not get smashed in class. Roger that. But later on, you ought to exercise more critical ability, because how are you going to use all the Lincoln Logs and the Legos that you've amassed from coming to class, for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? How do you synthesize the data that you've absorbed? So you have to engage it from that respect, and also, running different intelligences. I think kinetic intelligence, so that this guy's moving like this. Okay, so I move my hips here, and then I touch here, and how is his arm looking? What does he do at what time, and what came first, the chicken or the egg? So you have to work through this stuff in addition to, you're in a kind of a greenhouse of pressure and friction, and you have to use will and focus, your ability to focus and push through discomfort in order to make something work through that kind of, as Clausewitz says, a resistant medium. And then, the windfalls of becoming more physically fit and seeing some kind of transformation and self-confidence and, that other stuff too. But
it's the ultimate bridge. It's the ultimate bridge between the person that is sedentary and only using the mind all the time. So just the kind of like, think of the bookworm, right? And then with no life experience, they're sort of locked away in a shed somewhere, and they might be brilliant intellectually, but they're lacking the body intelligence. And on the other end, you have these brutes that walk into the gyms. They have no brain cells working, and they're just pumping and just trying to get the physical physique going. So they might have a lot of body intelligence to a degree, but it's not fully intelligent because there's not the connection, the mind-body connection that needs to be established. And this is where you see genius level performances coming from people in martial arts in a different way than you would see it in weightlifting or even other sports, because there's that combat element, like you said, which is the pressure cooker. And so for me, martial arts, when I get on the mat, it's the perfect analogy to life. It's the perfect analogy to any challenge that you're going to face. You get to go to the gym and practice getting out of problems and problem solving while having pressure put on you. You're not in school, they're not doing exams with all this. They call it pressure, but it's not real pressure. There's a certain layer of
It
pressure,
is a kind of pressure. It is a
but
kind
it's
of pressure
different.
because
It's different in
it
combat.
is different. Yeah, of course, it's different. I mean, yes, it is different. But if you're going to go and excel in different aspects of life, you have to respond in kind to the rule set that's pushed on you. Right? You go to
Yes.
school, you don't have any say. You're just there, and you gotta pass this. Otherwise, you might get grounded.
Yeah.
You might lose your allowance money. But go to college, you might have to pay back these classes. I mean, that's its own venue. But I understand what you're saying. And the lack of comprehensive intelligence or integrated intelligence, if you're short or overly surplus in a certain category, you won't succeed in a place like the dojo, at least on the off, because someone comes in there with an anchor that used to be a strength on the ocean, but it ain't, going into a very integrated atmosphere such as a dojo. So
Hmm.
your point is very clear.
Yeah, I was just saying that, like, the idea is funny because before we were talking a little bit about, the process of going through the stress in order to achieve something. And a lot of people think it's about the belts and the ranks and all the medals and all that. And that's all just that's there to, in the beginning, we understand you need to help give people this apparatus of how to be self-oriented and how to be in a positive way and how to be motivated. But eventually you don't care about that. You're working on this concept of delayed gratification, where you're strengthening that, because in order to have anything worth having, you must delay your gratification. It's not just all instant. It's not just, hey, I walk into a dojo, I do a class, I'm a black belt. It's like, no, in order to achieve the status of a black belt, which means you've refined yourself through struggle and pressure and all that through years and years of training, you have to delay the gratification of feeling like you've earned something. So, and that's the greatest reward. You also get instant feedback in the dojo if you're doing something wrong. Whereas sometimes when you're doing business or you're doing anything else, you're not getting the feedback right away. You might go for a long time thinking you're doing something, wrong, or doing something right when it's not. Whereas if you go on the mat and you try to test out, I've only trained striking, I have no ground game, and you're like, I'm going to do great, and you get taken down by someone that knows jiu-jitsu, all of a sudden, instantly you get the feedback that, oh, I was missing something. And then to extrapolate from that, you're not just focused on, oh, I want to know how to win. You're training your mind and body of how to be constantly open, receptive, continue to study, perfecting yourself, allowing yourself to make mistakes so that you can correct course. This is all extremely valuable. I just wish this stuff was taught more in schools.
I mean, if you lack the will to, I'm sure you've seen people walk into your gym or another gym, and they get smashed, and they quickly realize it's not worth it for whatever that amounted to for them internally. It wasn't worth it. Okay, so I think to compel people to fight outside of war, when much less is at stake, recreational combat is not everybody's cup of tea, and understandably so, for various reasons.
Hmm.
I wanted to, sorry, Dave. I wanted to touch on the mind guard thing that Michael brought up. Interesting though that yeah, with the lack of response to with a lack of positive or constructive response to limitations, you are left with mind guards in that context because they provide the solution. If I'm unable to do little more than throw my hands up in the air at a given challenge or whatever kind of imposition, and I don't know how to get a workaround there, then someone else can come in and give you the relief from having to think about it. And that's not a bad thing because, socially speaking, society is bound together by a mutual exchange of services, amongst other things. But that's the hallmark of a capitalist society, is that people can provide unique services, that others or that I cannot do for myself. So in a sense, it's good. But in the mind guard connotation, not so great. Particularly if it was done in such a way that is intentionally disempowering to the person who's offered that solution. And much of your
But the
work
thing
has
is that,
gone into it.
well, my work goes into that exists. We take it for granted because, as I said, we find ourselves in that world. We don't invent it, right? Overtly. But the mind guard can also be something that you police within. And then as my thought increased and got more mature through reading Reich and these people, it ceased to be an intellectual process of self-censorship or any of the syndromes and complexes by which we negate selfhood, of which there are innumerable ones. It also took on a physiological aspect in the shape of armoring. And you actually speak about this in the book as well. So that martial arts, one could even argue primarily, although your book says, no, it's across the board equally. But let's start with that maybe, about body armoring being one of these sort of consequences of a bad relationship with yourself. You can't take hold of the reins of reality if you're in inner conflict. That inner conflict is not just mental. That's just, I think David just mentioned that, and it's very, very true. And so for me, always, the little bit that I know about martial arts, I've always seen it as as addressing armoring. What can you say about that in the Reichian sort of context? Bodily purification, a certain amount of knowledge, also just turning knowledge about the body, which
Well,
is sorely lacking in our world.
I mean, I think at a grassroots level, when you don't have any other kind of knowledge outside of, phantom pains or, some kind of ache in your back, and there doesn't seem to be a reason, but like you said, I forgot when and where, but on numerous occasions, okay, when you're ill, you turn your attention inward. Oh, this flu, it's really sucking. And then that attention's there. But the same is also with whatever the body is undergoing. And if you're willing to look at that and, at the very least, like say, I busted my knee 6 years ago. And I basically had to repair it myself through a combination of stretching and strengthening and taking it easy and ice and all this stuff, everything in between. And then after 2 years, I didn't have any more problems with the knee. It was fine. I can go and fight jiu-jitsu tournaments, mixed martial arts fights. Never a problem with the knee after that. But, hypothetically, if I would have went to go see a chiropractor, for instance, then, well, that's one way that I'm sure they would sit there and tell you, well, this, chiropractics, it's really going to do something for that knee. Or physical therapy. Or, you go to the one guy and they tell you something, but I'm a little short on cash. You're a little short on, something outside of this singular solution, and somewhere in the between, it doesn't work for me right now. So I had no choice but to, figure that one out. And by doing that, though, I got a lot out of that given experience, having to fix my own knee. So the question was mind, body, Reichian. So I would say then that, even on the most grassroots level, that a kind of curiosity should be lent towards the sensations of the body, that they matter, and not outside, and not only exclusive to injury. Certain occurrences transpire within the body in the midst of conversation, you know, like not body positioning, body movement, and whether you have compulsions to move your body a certain way. Like if I can't quite remember something, I'll move something to jostle the memory, right? Or when people avoid eye contact for varying reasons. You know, there's entire books on body language, so there certainly is some preface to it. But because I'm not all that familiar with Reich, I cannot say much to his research outside of what I've heard periodically through Unslaved. But just, you know, from, if I have nothing, because that's a limitation, I don't have that specialization of knowledge pertaining to certain somatic aspects of the body intelligence, but I have common sense and grassroots, and I know enough to value what the body may be saying to me and to take note of what other bodies might be doing. So this amounts to making something out of nothing.
Well, I was thinking that, see, in combat with another, and I agree with you that there's their Hegelian thing that in relation to other people, we learn about ourselves. So martial arts can be seen as very much selfhood, but in a crowd, or, you know, learning about oneself through the other. And since they're doing the same thing there, it's almost like subject and object in one sense collapse. This was what fascinated Hegel, that in the midst of what you think is a empowering of a selfhood and a sort of a combative aspect with somebody else, as a matter of fact, that's one way that the whole subject-object dichotomy actually collapses, because each person is mirroring key aspects and traits of the other. So that's already fascinating, and you do allude to this in your book. But in regards of just the physical body, I was thinking that combativeness, that process I just described, is also internal, both in a positive and negative way. The armoring is defensiveness. The defensiveness you see in the, you know, attack position or defense position of somebody else. So we sort of fucking embody this shit, right? And so what I got out of your book is that you're addressing this. You know, I don't know if it was explicit, but it's, to me, it's very implicit. And that's a kind of martial arts in which, you know, you don't even need an opponent in that sense, because you've got to notice this dynamic. So armoring, which is, you know, this sort of is exactly what it says. It's like a spastication of one's own being against one's own being. What could be thought of as more unbelievable? And then the process of trying with your, it's like if I touch my body, right, to scratch or to heal myself or grab an injury, how is that even possible? The body is injured, but the body is uninjured to deal with the injury. There's something very weird and euroboric going on there. So here's another part of the body that's in wellness, addressing some issue that is, you know, unwell or unhealthy. That's the dynamic I was addressing, because I think you actually are dealing with it in the book, you know, actually, because you bring up this Hegelian quote actually in the book, now that I do remember more specifically, that Hegel is saying you're already in opposition. You know, remember that quote you have, that, you know, you can't even be a self without opposition, which kind of, you know, encapsulates what we were talking about.
I exist insofar as I'm opposed. That's paraphrasing it, but pertaining to what you're saying, that's the point of even conceiving of mental martial arts, is that you have varying forms of information shooting through you, say at any given point in time. You know, the intuition is you know, saying one thing, the emotions might be saying a different. You might be compelled to speak, but then also feel the sense of not saying anything at the same time. And so, you know, in, say, an instance like that, in a social instance, usually, by my experience, it would do well to not say exactly what you're going to say, but maybe find a different way to say it. And that would be a one way to satisfy that given dichotomy, is that if you wanted to say something, but you also feel the same compulsion not to say it, that by changing it in some way, you can find the entrance for it. But coming back to internal communication only, you have to, as you say, untie that knot so that these things work together within themselves and that they don't conflict. But then regarding limitation, once again, you find different ways to loosen it up so that these information pathways can complement each other, and you can make the best sense, or you're fit to make better decisions in most scenarios you're in, whether it's only in a subjective sense or interacting with the world. That's the point. Otherwise, what's the point?
Well, don't martial arts, I don't know about jiu-jitsu, but doesn't, maybe David, because I know it may be true for something like qigong, but isn't there a martial arts where, was it Aikido or something? I don't remember now, but owning your own space. I mean, actually focusing. Western man never focuses on this. But isn't there something like where there's a circle around you, you command your own space outside of your relationships with others, and that a relationship with another, if it, say it was intimate, it's more obvious to us, obviously, but even in a normal sense, a business sense, or just a normal everyday sense, that you're sharing not just yourself, but your space. Is there anything in martial arts that talks about this sort of a ambient space that you command that is actually part of the self?
I
I
think all of
suppose
it.
you could say you're right. All of them essentially address that. If not worded, like maybe in more Eastern styles, they might specifically say of the energetic qualities, but then they all innately do. But then if we went to jujitsu, then you're having to work within that space. You want to, Dave, pass someone's guard. So you have to get around those legs and then navigate to pin them with their back on the mat. And then to keep them there, you might have to get some form of head and arm control. And then by doing these things, that they're also attempting to do stuff to you and recapture and deny your advancement into this progressive transition to them being in an inferior position. So this whole time you're attempting to do this, they're attempting to do something else. So if you're only to fight entrenched in a given position, well, that would be highly taxing for both people, and then it would just become a war of attrition rather than a war of maneuver and timing. And then the mind is more deducted out of the equation, and it's more of a physical emphasis, if that were the case. But
It's like
you
Mushu.
have to then interact intelligently. Some portion of intelligence is required when you're interacting there with the person in your space like that, because there's almost no room to maneuver. Almost. But it's not true, because there is. It's a
Right.
sensitivity that's developed over time.
Yeah, and I agree. And what I would say, just from experiencing many different martial arts, there was something you would do in karate, which a lot of jiu-jitsu people make fun of, which is kind of funny to me. But in karate, I grew up doing kata, and what kata were they were not rehearsed combat scenarios. They were working on different movements and patterns. And the idea was that I liked it when I was growing up because you're fighting this invisible force. Really, that's what you're doing. You're practicing movements and technique, but you're fighting an invisible force. And I would always imagine in my mind like I was getting attacked by like a band of ninjas or something, or I was being surrounded. Because as a youngster, I felt surrounded. I felt surrounded by, bullies at school. I felt surrounded by pressures at home. I felt surrounded by, even inside, I felt just overcrowded with thoughts that I couldn't verify, and it was confusing. And I think all young people go through this. So in my early teens, it really helped me to work on kata because it helped shape me psychologically to learn how to defend my space and to understand that there's a thing about drawing the line in the sand. And this was encapsulated beautifully in the Lord of the Rings film when Gandalf is trying to protect the group when this big demon from the underworld comes up to try to take them down. And he walks up. He looks like this old man. And it's such a powerful scene in the movie when he just javelins his wizard cane or whatever into the ground. And he's like, "You shall not pass." And it was it was a statement to evil. It was a statement to that part of, even in your psyche. Forget about the physical part of the movie. Think about it internally as a metaphor for, not letting those self-defeating thoughts come in, not letting the negativity that is not going to serve you come in, not letting the opinions of other people come in to crowd your space. So in martial arts, whether it's boxing or karate or jiu-jitsu, now jiu-jitsu is unique because what you said, Eric, is true, is that jiu-jitsu is designed to take you down to the tightest possible quarters and help you understand how to maneuver out of the worst possible positions that you could be in. And that's incredibly useful because, we've all gone through periods of time, maybe Mercury retrograde or something. I know I just recently went through a pretty crazy period of time, and you feel like everything's heavy on you. You feel like, oh, it's all these thoughts, all this stress, all this pressure is weighing on me. And so in jiu-jitsu, you have somebody physically weighing on you and compressing your space and forcing you to fight out of it using your intelligence. You're not just biting and scratching the guy. You have to use maneuvering, technique. You have to have proper breathing. You have to have a good understanding of how to get the timing going. And you can't get the timing going if you haven't drilled it and practiced it continuously, so that you're not thinking when you're fighting. You're using your, it's an awake intelligence. They sometimes would discuss it as mushin, which means no mind, where you're not letting the logical brain interfere too much. It's more of a free flow. And this is when you watch black belts or you watch high level performers. They make these things look easy. They easily dispatch people. They easily escape things. That's just because of the time in. So in one sense, the fight starts standing and you're defending your space and you're saying, I'm not going to allow you to attack me. And then when the fight transitions to a position to the ground, we've taken the space away. That's when you're going through the hierarchy of positions, the pins, the submissions, and all of that. And so for me, martial arts has always been and will always be a metaphor for life and an amazing lab where you can go in and test principles out and see how the feedback comes from nature as to whether what you're doing is efficient and correct or whether it's not.
Mushin, the no mind, is akin to the central pillar on the Kabbalistic tree. It's like the same thing.
Oh, I didn't even think of it like that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Because the central pillar, if I remember correctly, is all feminine polarities or energies.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the paths.
So to be absolutely receptive, like, the situations where you got no say at all.
Right.
You got no say at all. I mean, maybe when you're a kid and your mother grabs you by the ear and it's on. Yeah, that's one. But when you're older, maybe your girlfriend or your wife's telling you gotta go do something and you don't got any say at all. That's it. Or you go into a dojo and man, you know what? This guy's got to get ready for a fight. He's got to spar with you. Sorry, bro. Ooh, yeah, no say at all. Or all the other permutations, where the best you could be is willingly receptive to these moments. So on a macrocosmic level, that you have to bend to superior force. Like they say in Dune, when he's fighting Sting in that movie, right? He'll bend like a reed in the wind because Sting was really going to get him, right? But then that's how he overcame him, was going with the force that he exerted at that moment. So from a snap like that to more elongated periods of time, that it's required to bring that kind of receptivity to the table in order to get through whatever period that is, or to absorb whatever meaningful thing.
Well, it's interesting that you said kata, because kata in English means to break down, like catabolic. So the commandment of your space, in that particular karate, just happens to be, on a symbolic level, kata is to break down. So it's a way of breaking down the adversarial power, like in a court of law, where you rhetoricize them, bring out the truth by way of language, or in another sense through physicality, through a sort of mirroring, right? And this catabolic is so essential because that's what breaking down the armoring is all about. Mental armoring or physical armoring is a action within yourself that is deconstructive. Obviously, it can be taken too far, and then the result will be total passivity and docility, which again will send you in the wrong direction, because when you need security, then you'll get it from the crowd. But a certain amount of to me, and the best of the Eastern systems always are catabolic in that sense. And our Western medicine hasn't still understood that at all. They can barely get people to change their fucking diets, which is catabolic, isn't it? To lower weight and to think about what they're eating and buying and all of that. So it's just a word. It's just a set of words. My hope is that the people who join dojos and seek out the martial arts, they've maybe non-conscious is the better word, but they're seeking for that way of life, which is to go fallow, to be receptive, like you say, the central pillar there. But that's only an in-between stage while they regroup their own selfhood, right? The fallow period must not be taken as a universal passivity, which philosophers of the highest level have actually advocated. I'm against that. The passivity should be like a fallow field. It should be there for a time to let nutrients, come back, to let the rain fall, to replenish or revision a view of the self, where there's a shift from the superego to the conscience, that will come in everybody's life. In fact, it comes pretty much at every rite of passage, doesn't it? But the ultimate martial arts, see, you guys are practicing actually, must embody these rites of passage, must intelligently embody that fact of the catabolic. Otherwise, you get people, like you say, the jocks who are just coming in, it's all wrong. It's all wrong in the mind at all. And then they won't be able to command their space or that of another correctly, because they still haven't downloaded this very, very crucial element, I think, and as part of the reason is balance, to balance all different states. Reason is the supervailing sort of force that says, let me not let one aspect of my personality dominate or get out of control, right? People forget that the reason doesn't just mean this acquisitive ownership of the world or of another person or of some sort of calculative scientific deductiveness. It's a way of keeping one's whole character and personality in balance. So balance must play a big role in the martial arts. Does it? Do they emphasize that as well? Like, sense of equilibrium and balance?
Go ahead, Eric.
Well, there's certainly going back to those, limitations. Like if you overextend yourself in a strike or in an attempt to subdue or to take away something from, someone in a combative situation, it's those overextensions that can be exploited, and then you'll get either swept, tossed, submitted, choked, or whatever other thing in between there. So clearly, if you do that, there's an uppercut waiting for you right under the chin every time, especially when the opponent is very deft. And as far as limitations are concerned with the reason, if you were to circumcise your emotional or common sense forms of intelligence, that would be, well, one means of going towards an amoral or immoral way with the kind of power that would have been actualized from martial arts or any derivative of that, such as mental martial arts, I think I addressed specifically, people attempting to cash a check off of the emotional transactions in any given relationship. People who attempt to use emotions is probably one of the poorest currencies you can ever scry. In terms of putting a lien on somebody. I made you feel good. That it's not directly said like this, but the thought process is, I made you feel good the other day. So can you do this lopsided favor for me? Is the equivalent that's being put there, and so that's one of the things that you could say parasitic types. They're attempting to edge their bets. People will go running through the store at Black Friday to get the biggest bang for their buck. Well, people do that in relationships too. People do that in relationships too. And that's a real nasty way to go about it in life, because you sacrifice what could have been in place for, short-term, short-sighted gains. And when people are smarter than that and see through that kind of stuff, then, you kind of isolate yourself out of social equations.
Right.
I
So
agree.
going to your question.
No, I agree with that. And that brings up the whole Hegelian point again, that in the other, I see myself. But there's also the downside of that, where people who, realizing that, don't want to engage too deeply, because it will mean that they have to transform. They'll have to transform. We're coming up on the hour. I've got a quote from your book, but maybe we should leave that till we come back, and then you can take us through some of the slides as well. Shall we do that, David?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. Let's take a little break here. I'll stay on with the members, and you guys take what you need, get refreshed. and then we'll come back and we'll
Okay.
run through all of your slides. I'm excited to get into them with you, Eric.
Good,
How much time is the break?
Like 2 or 3 minutes.
All right.
5 minutes. What do you
Thanks.
need? Okay, cool.
5.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
thanks.